Oh, hello, Professor
Hey.
Smith. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm good. So we are all here.
Hello, I'm Laurent Coulon. I'm the director of the IFAO. So very pleased to, and thank you for accepting to. Hello, I'm Laurent Coulon. I'm the director of the IFAO.
Yeah, very good to meet you too. And I'm just sorry that I can't be there in person. I was really looking forward to it when Elena, proposed the conference. I was really looking forward to spending some time in Egypt again, but
Thank
sadly,
you.
not to be. And of course, at the Institute.
And Anna Wodzinska is the director of the Polish Institute in Cairo, and we have co-organized this colloquium, both the IFAO and the Polish Institute. So,
yeah, hello. I see. Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to say it's nice to meet you here. And I have, like last year I was in Tombos, so I love this place.
Yes.
I wish I had more time and, to visit the place more and when you're around, but now I'm here in Cairo, but I really love this place. So it's great site.
Yes, it's a wonderful site and it's a nice little village. And I love the location at the Third Cataract. It's just so beautiful.
Yes. I mean, this is the usual thing with cataracts, but this one I think is especially beautiful. So yeah, I'm a bit jealous. I said to my colleagues that I'll have a house one day there.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is great to have you here. So yeah, unfortunately we cannot meet in person, but yeah.
Yeah, it's a shame, but but we'll do our best. I'm impressed that you were able to pull this together in the context of the pandemic and everything. So
yeah. Okay, so we still have a few minutes. Then yeah, well, I'll leave you to your presentation.
Sur YouTube et dans le Zoom, tout. On va les admettre. Tu veux présenter de là-bas ou là?
Ah non, oui.
All right.
C'est juste, il va falloir...
Nice. There we go.
Right.
So good evening, everybody. I'm Laurent Coulon, the director of the French Institute of Oriental Archaeology in Cairo. And together with Anna Wodzinska, the director of the Polish Institute in Cairo, we are very pleased to welcome you for the first keynote lecture of the international conference organized by Elena Panaite. So this conference is entitled Meeting the Other Transfers and Cultural Interactions Around the Nile Valley. We'll have the opportunity to introduce this topic more deeply tomorrow morning. I just wanted to say a few words of welcoming and to also thank our speaker tonight, Stuart Smith, who will give the first keynote lecture. And I will let now Elena Panaite say a few words of introduction.
Thank you, Director Laurent Coulon. So it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Stuart T. for the first lecture of the conference that will start tomorrow morning, Egypt time, meeting the other, transfers and cultural interactions around the Nile Valley. Professor Smith works in the Department of Anthropology, and he is also director of the Institute for Social, Behavioral, and Economic Research at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Professor Smith focuses his research on the ancient civilizations of Egypt and Nubia, and in particular on the identification of ethnicity in archaeological record and on the ethnic dynamics of colonial encounters. He's the author of several publications that deal with the ethnic, social, and economic dynamics of interactions between Egypt and Nubia. And more specifically, his academic works address, for instance, the issues of the constructions of self and other in ancient Egypt, of the colonial entanglement of immigration, acculturation, and hybridity in the territory of the ancient Nubia. He's also an active field archaeologist, having participated in and led archaeological expeditions in Egypt and since 1997 in Sudanese Nubia. Here, along with co-director Professor Michel Buzon, he directs excavations at Third Cataract of the Nile in the New Kingdom and at Napatan Cemetery of Tombos. Last but not least, you can also discover another aspect of his work by watching the movies Stargate and The Mummy. Indeed, he worked as a consultant for the recreation of ancient Egyptian language in these two movies. Let's virtually welcome Professor Stuart Smith on Entangled Lives, Egyptian in Nubians, and Nubians in Egypt. Professor?
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you for organizing this conference, yourself, IFAO, and the Polish Institute, as well as congratulations for meeting the challenges of life in the pandemic and pulling this together in spite of that. I'm only sorry that I can't be there in person. I would have loved to have actually attended. Since I've been working in Sudan, I haven't had too many opportunities to excavate in Egypt. So let me just get things started. Yeah. Okay. So in spite of the Egyptocentric emphasis on Egypt's cultural impact on Nubia, Nubian culture entangled with and influenced Egyptian society through an accumulation of individual interactions, both at home and in the colonial communities founded during the Middle and New Kingdom, as well as after the conquest of Egypt by the Kushite dynasty, which itself is usually thought of as completely Egyptianized. Nubian cultural impacts varied over time within Egypt and in different parts of the empire, and in the early and later kingdoms of Kush. This paper takes a regional approach that compares and contrasts Nubian influence on Egyptian society in Nubia and Egypt during these three periods. Entanglement provides a useful model to understand the intercultural interactions between the two regions, in particular understanding how Nubian civilization came to influence Egypt. And first I'll have a bit of a critique of some Egyptological views of the topic, then a bit of theory, and then I'll move on to a few select case studies, including an extended discussion of some of our work at Tombos and a couple of insights from other sites. Intercultural interaction between Egypt and Nubia has often been seen through the lens of Egyptianization, a one-way transfer of a superior core culture to a subordinate periphery. Barry Kemp articulated a common view of ancient Egypt's civilizing effect in the New Kingdom, asserting that, and I quote, Egyptian culture must have had a considerable glamour in the eyes of Nubians. It is not hard to understand how, in an age innocent of the esoteric delights of folk culture, many of the local products, such as decorated handmade pottery and mother-of-pearl trinkets did not survive the flood of cheap, mass-produced Egyptian wares. He concludes that, and I quote, some recognition at least should be given to the positive side of this early attempt to extend what, to the Egyptians themselves, was a civilized way of life. Decades earlier, Wilson had portrayed Pianki's Kushite culture as, and I quote, a provincial imitation of earlier Egypt, characterizing his triumphal stela as, quote, a contrast between this backwater Puritan and the effete and sophisticated Egyptians, end quote. Breasted in 1909 saw the Napatan civilizations, saw the Napatan civilization's inevitable decline in these terms, and I quote, as the Egyptians resident in the country died out and were not replaced by others, the Egyptian gloss which the people had received began rapidly to disappear, end quote. As recently as 2004, Donald Redford noted that while Kushite kings were buried according to Egyptian customs in pyramids, Meroitic art, disconnected from Egyptian influence, quote, became increasingly bastardized and degenerate. This logic was founded upon a racialized ranking of essentialized categories of Egyptian and Nubian. In the early 20th century, this is implied by Breasted and made explicit by Reisner, who characterized the early Kushite capital of Kerma as an Egyptian colony that inevitably declined from the, and I quote, physical degeneration produced by the increasing proportion of non-Egyptian blood in the individual members of the community. The continuing use of terminology like Negroid and Caucasoid to classify artistic renderings and even the physical remains of Nubians and Egyptians is a direct legacy of racist systems of classification developed in the 19th century, including the foundational text for scientific, quote unquote, racism, Types of Mankind, published in 1854 by slavery advocate Josiah Knott and Egyptologist George Glidden, a founding figure in American Egyptology. If you look at his biographies, they gloss over this work of this creation of an Egyptian Caucasoid master race over the Negroid underclass. The Hamitic hypothesis also draws upon this idea and continues to crop up implicitly, if not explicitly. To be fair, this kind of typological thinking is reinforced by the representation of foreigners in Egyptian ideology, what Loprieno characterizes as the Ausländer topos. As I've discussed elsewhere, these literary and artistic ethnic stereotypes were designed to create characterizations of self and other that are fundamental to the construction of ethnic identity. As a result, Egyptian ideologues created imagery that focused on contrasting phenotypes, as you can see here on Tutankhamun's painted box, but also hairstyles, dress, jewelry, and body modification. Foreigners were characterized in the Ausländer topos in negative terms, representing the disorder that surrounded civilized inner order, emphasizing the moral and political authority of the king and Egyptian civilization. This is masterfully rendered in microcosm in Tutankhamun's box, with the Egyptian soldier confidently striding on the battlefield, surrounded by a chaotic array of dead and dying Nubians. These ideological tropes have led to a tendency for Egyptologists to produce what were in reality complex cultural and biological interrelationships and reduce them to a simple racialized binary, Egyptian versus Nubian, lighter Caucasoid versus darker Negroid, civilized versus barbarian, at least in terms of Egyptian attitudes. These representations should not be taken literally. In terms of phenotype, all of the putatively racial features, in particular skin color, hair, nose shape, and so on, are distributed not in bounded groups like Negroid or Caucasoid, but rather in continuous and gradual clinal variation due to natural selection. For example, skin color grows lighter and darker along a north-south cline, darkest at the equator, lighter in Northern Africa, and in Southern Africa. Because of this clinal variation and the constant mixing of peoples, the contrasting features created by Egyptian ideologues cannot be mapped neatly onto ancient populations. They are nonetheless relevant to our discussion, but must be recognized, like virtually all Egyptian art, as abstract and symbolic rather than literal, and thus must be properly contextualized. The same consideration applies to negative stereotypes in literature. There is no a priori reason to think that a Nubian arriving in Egypt would be greeted with hostility, or vice versa, and the same for people from Libya, Western Asia, and so forth. The lingering effect of racism and colonial attitudes towards Nubia sometimes produced a sense among Egyptologists that Egyptians were more open to borrowing cultural features from a putatively civilized Western Asia than from uncivilized Nubia. For example, the late Bruce Trigger argued that during the New Kingdom, Levantine vassals were seen as civilized and thus treated as subject states and taxed, while Nubians were thought of as barbarians, and so the region was reorganized along Egyptian lines. But in the Ausländer topos, all foreigners were barbarians. Asiatics and Nubians, as well as Libyans and other groups, were treated with equal contempt. In contrast, more prosaic documents relate positive interactions between Egyptians and foreign others, characterized by Loprieno as reflecting mimesis, and including both Nubians and Asiatics, and of course other peoples as well. An effective way to move beyond the essentialized and often racialized categories that Egyptian, Nubian, Libyan, and Asiatic is through the use of Dietler's materialist, consumption-based model of cultural entanglement. He provides a robust theoretical framework that can be used to understand, and I quote, the complex webs of economic, political, social, and cultural linkages that can result, often inadvertently, from the consumption of alien material culture. And that would include practices and so on in that as well. Entanglement takes into consideration the agency of both indigenous and intrusive groups for the purposes of this discussion, whether they are Egyptians in Nubia or Nubians in Egypt. But cultures do not interact, people do, in an active process of intercultural consumption involving the appropriation and adaptation, but also the indifference to and rejection of different objects or practices. These exchanges between individuals can be further understood through a practice approach, with cultural change produced through a constant dialectic between the constraints of habitus, cultural predispositions to an extent shared by other members of society, and the pressure of individual adaptation and innovation that comes to the fore, especially through interaction and exposure to different practices. Dietler argues persuasively that through a nuanced analysis of the intersection of different social and cultural logics of the parties involved, agency is both potentially discernible and historically crucial to understanding larger developments. Dietler's model contrasts with Philip Stockhammer's idea of entanglement, used, for example, by Van Pelt in his critique of the concept of Egyptianization. Stockhammer sees the outcome of entanglement in homogenizing terms, as a creation of a new kind of hybrid that, as Dietler points out in more general terms, obscures the role of individuals and the diverse expressions of entanglement that occur in the context of intercultural interaction. And hybridity has undergone a sustained critique within anthropological archaeology. When I use terms like Nubian and Egyptian, I do not mean to imply essentialized categories, but cultural configurations that were changing and variable, multiscalar and overlapping. There were different ways of being Egyptian and Nubian. Through entanglement, cultural threads might be woven into new patterns through an accumulation of individual choices that laid the groundwork for cultural change and political manipulations of identity. Over time, the adoption and adaptation of foreign features would become internalized, ceasing to be marked as Egyptian or Nubian or anything else other than ours. For example, Kushite pyramids had arguably ceased to be Egyptian and had in fact become a quintessentially Nubian or Kushite monumental form by the time of the 25th dynasty, adapted and integrated into a Kushite ideology of kingship. Starting in the Middle Kingdom, Nubian military practices had begun to influence Egyptian military culture. By the New Kingdom, Nubian entanglements with the Egyptian military had deepened. Military officials like Mahepri reflect an entangled mimesis similar to the soldiers of Jebelain. As a child of the nursery, he was likely the son of a Nubian prince who was raised at court in order to cement ties to the future pharaoh. Like the earlier soldiers at Jebelain, about whom we'll hear later in the conference, and I'm really interested to hear that presentation, although I'm not sure if I can, depending on the time, I'm not sure if I can attend. But it's really fascinating work. He appears with some of the features of the Nubian topos, in particular dark skin, a kind of physiognomy, and a Nubian hairstyle, which was preserved on his mummy. By this time, however, the tightly curled hairstyle that had become fashionable and would signal a military affiliation as a marker of Nubian identity, as much as a marker of Nubian identity. Elements of his jewelry also reflect ties to Nubia, including ivory bracelets, armlets, a beaded choker, which are also worn by the offspring of Nubian princes, for example, in Hui's tomb and in other contexts. And his grave goods included an elaborate ebony and ivory bracelet. He was also equipped with a bow and a variety of arrows, some of which were for hunting, but others might have had a military purpose, including microlith-tipped arrowheads with a deep Nubian connection. Thousands of similar arrows were uncovered in the armory at Mergissa, and as you'll see, we found some at Tombos as well. A box found near the entrance to his tomb and labeled with his name contained 2 gazelle leather loincloths of amazing craftsmanship. This kind of costume reflects a clear Nubian influence, similar to this finely crafted perforated leatherwork from the Kerma cemetery Abu Fatima near Tombos, where we're currently excavating, although this particular example was likely from a pillow rather than a garment. He also had 2 dog collars, and you see one of them here with horses on it. And while the Egyptians also kept dogs, they are particularly associated with Nubians in a funerary context, possibly in Egypt at Jebel Ain, and here at Abu Fatma in a Kerma context, where we found a burial of a dog. Also, we found a Meroitic burial of the dog accompanying a human into the afterlife. Dogs also played a role in both hunting and military complex, as you can see here on Tutankhamun's box. Scenes like this one reflecting the topos nevertheless show the overlapping nature of hairstyle, skin coloring, and military costume between Egyptians and Nubians, or at least individuals serving in the Egyptian army versus the foreign other as a part of the topos. In the case of my hairpre, the retention of Nubian features might represent personal choices, but elements associated with Nubianness might also have had positive connotations, signaling his military role. And then here's another scene from the box showing the overlap between the garments, especially the hairstyle as well, that don't divide Nubians from Egyptians as much as one might think. The term Nehesi is often translated as black in the modern racial sense. As I pointed out elsewhere, this is based on a rather strained and clearly false etymology created in an attempt to map modern racial attitudes onto the ancient Egyptians. In fact, the root Nes means to bite or sting in ancient Egyptian, an apt metaphor for the Nubian fame as skilled archers, a trope that appears throughout Egyptian history and in later sources, at least down to the accounts of the Arab conquest of Egypt. As John Baines and Shamarka Keita have pointed out, the ancient Egyptians had no concept of blackness, and outside of the topos, dark skin, if anything, had positive connotations. For example, connected with Osiris and the fertile black land of Egypt. At a minimum, my hairpre's privileged status and close royal connections demonstrate a lack of color prejudice in ancient Egypt. This conclusion is further reinforced by evidence for royal marriage to Egyptians, including the wives of Neb-Hepet-Re Mentuhotep. And it's important to recognize that there was a considerable phenotypic diversity within Egypt in antiquity, as there is today. It was not a homogeneous population. The role and importance of Nubian women as ritual specialists in the cult of Hawthorne and important members of the royal family and court from the Middle Kingdom onwards has also been disparaged or questioned in the Egyptological literature. Solange Ashby persuasively argues for the importance of Nubian forms of ritual music and dance that were incorporated into Egyptian rituals of Hathor, who is intimately associated with Nubia through the myth of the sun's eye. All too often, these important women are treated in even recent literature as simple dancers or concubines, emphasizing, for example, their wild, dancing, and barbarous costume, a view that comes from earlier racist scholarly frameworks, as Ashby rightly calls out. Women dedicated to the cult of Hathor played a key role in the court of Neb-Hepet-Re Mentuhotep. 6 women bearing the titles of royal wife and priestess of Hathor, like Ashayet, who you see here, had elaborate tombs and chapels within his mortuary complex at Thebes. They are shown with dark skin and have names indicating Nubian ancestry, but again, in a positive, not a negative context. While Kemp has questioned their role as queens, he does acknowledge their importance at court, and to my mind, their elaborate burials within the royal complex reflect their intimate and central role in the royal family. Additionally, I've argued elsewhere that they may have played a role in cementing ties between the new court and important Nubian allies, although of course this is speculative, but it's plausible, I think. In any case, along with other women performing in the cult, they clearly played an important role in ritual performances, resulting in enduring theological entanglements between Nubian and Egyptian cultic practice, including distinctive forms of dance, tattooing, and music, as detailed by Ashby. It's important to remember that ethnic expression is fluid and contingent and need not be the primary aspect of identity emphasized in a particular social context, where other axes of identity, in this case, gender and religion, could come to the fore. And in fact, this represents a kind of intersectionality. Over the course of the Middle Kingdom, Egyptian forces gained control over Lower Nubia and established a chain of fortresses aimed at the geopolitical threat from the rising power of the Kingdom of Kush, based at Kerma. And here you see the massive Defufa temple complex that dominates the center of the city. These forts also serve to manage and facilitate trade and the exploitation of resources, especially gold mining, which is directly attested at Asgut and contemporary sites in the nearby Saras Plain, as well as elsewhere in the fortress system. As I've discussed elsewhere, oh, and then here's the location of the site of Abu Fatma and Tombos. As I've discussed elsewhere, the fortress community is entangled with local cultures, resulting in mutual influence in the fortresses, especially in the areas of foodways and private ritual practice. You see here a beautiful little figurine found in a second intermediate period New Kingdom ritual context within a house. And the pattern and designs on the figurine are somewhat reminiscent of the tattooing discussed by Ashby in the context of the rituals of Hawthorne. Kushite civilization at Kerma, which has sometimes been characterized as Egyptianized, largely resisted Egyptian influence, instead adapting some Egyptian technologies and motifs into an entangled local setting, very likely with the help of Egyptians from colonial establishments like Asgut, especially after the fortress communities came under Kushite control in the second intermediate period. The appearance of Kerma Moyen style pottery, and you can see here these cooking pots in the top level, set it apart from other fortresses and hints at even earlier entanglements, perhaps between Asgut and some of the other fortresses, even during the period when before Kerma took the region over. Needler's model of entanglement recognizes choice in the consumption of material culture and ideas, emphasizing three basic options: adoption, adaptation, including innovation, and indifference or rejection. For example, in Kerma's urban core, the Egyptian technology of monumental mud brick construction that proved so important to the fortresses and Middle Kingdom pyramids was adapted to create a distinctively Kushite monument, an artificial mountain with a cave shrine and a high place that dominated the core of the city. Architectural forms were also entangled with different combinations of rectilinear and circular or ovoid layout. The cemetery de Fufas, massive mortuary temple complexes, employed a similar mud brick architecture and an axial layout that reflects some Egyptian influence. The monument itself, though, is adaptive, including its decoration employing imagery like a lintel with a sun disk and winged sun disk, and extensive elements in faience, you can see with leonine motifs and other designs drawn from Egypt, but unique in their application. As well as this kind of starry ceiling. Decoration inside included motifs emphasizing a variety of other animals, including bulls, giraffe, and hippos, the first resonating with the long-standing practice of placing bucrania around royal and private graves and the bovine feet of furniture, and the others decorative motifs found in furniture inlays. Kushite potters largely rejected the use of the wheel, continuing to produce fineware pottery like this late classic Kerma bowl we found at Abu Fatma. This in spite of a well-attested wheel throne industry at the fortresses, which continued into the second intermediate period and into the New Kingdom at Asgut and elsewhere, where a late Middle Kingdom wheelhead was found, you see here on the right, one of the only examples attested. It is not hard to see how this amazing ceramic tradition appealed to the Kushites in favor of the more prosaic Egyptian industry in spite of Kemp's comments. In fact, Reisner was so impressed that he couldn't conceive the pottery was made by Nubians, to him black Africans, and so assumed that it must have been produced with the wheel in Egyptian fashion. But these pots, many of you will have seen them, are just incredible. They're amazingly crafted and all handmade, or at least the vast majority of them. Of course, Kemp was really referring to the idea that Nubian material culture and practices disappeared as part of a widespread Egyptianization that followed after the New Kingdom conquest. However, recent studies have shown that Nubian pottery was an integral part of the material repertoire in Egyptian contexts in both Nubia and Egypt from the Middle Kingdom through at least the early New Kingdom, including both fine and coarse wares, especially cooking pots that likely reflect both cultural and biological entanglements, particularly in the fortresses in southern Egypt. As for example, Raua and Forster Muller have suggested, as well as myself. Nubian cooking pottery is ubiquitous in later Egyptian contexts in occupied Nubia, but what about fine wares and other features of Nubian culture like burial practice? Recent archaeological work at Tombos and Amara West show that elements of Nubian culture never completely disappeared and can in fact be seen in continuing entanglements and material influence through the end of the New Kingdom and into the early Napatan or Third Intermediate period. Our work at Tombos has shed some light on these issues, The colony was founded around the reign of Thutmose III, Hatshepsut, and what appears to have been a major investment in colonial infrastructure between the second and third cataracts, including settlers from Egypt, confirmed at Tombos through strontium isotope analysis. These brought elite burial practices like the construction of small pyramids and other mud brick tombs, mummification and coffins, as well as high status items like heart scarabs, ushabtis, and even a copy of the Book of the Dead, the only one, as far as I know, attested from Nubia, bizarrely transferred onto a person's skull. And here's a visible induced luminescence image that enhanced the glyphs a bit. Thanks to Rita Lucarelli, by the way, and Irmtraut Munro for identifying this as a copy of the Book of the Dead from just little tiny fragments attached to various pieces of the skull. I am in awe of their skill. In spite of the dominant Egyptian character of the cemetery, Nubian material culture like Dot Pottery continues to appear, and female members of the community maintain traditional Nubian burial practices linked to karma, as you can see, especially in the particular layout of this flex burial. The appearance of Egyptian amulets in these contexts, including the dwarf god Bes, who became really prominent in Nubia later on, along with the juxtaposition of Nubian and Egyptian burial practices in the same tombs, points towards an initial phase of mutual cultural entanglement rather than pure Egyptianization. Thus far, all of the flex burials at Tombos are of women, pointing towards a gendered and intersectional dynamic. Starting in the Ramesside period, these entanglements deepened and became more overt with the addition of a separate cemetery with Nubian-style tumulus superstructures that also reflect entangled practices, as this Bat Hathor amulet attests, that from a little bit later in the Third Intermediate period, or early Nopatan period. Similar entanglements appear elsewhere within the New Kingdom colony, notably to the north at Amara West and upstream at Halad el Arab, but in different configurations driven by the specific social contexts and logics that prevailed in those places, as I've argued. And I'm really looking forward to Yulia's keynote touching on exactly this issue of diversity within the empire. Tombs among the tumuli combine a novel kind of local superstructure, utilizing granite from the adjacent outcrops, as you can see here, similar to the use of local stone at Amara West, with an Egyptian-inspired rectilinear shaft and side chamber substructure, east-west in orientation, with the body placed supine with head to the west, facing east to enjoy the rejuvenating powers of the rising sun in line with Egyptian theology. Nubian features, however, include the very common practice of burial on a bed, attested through the presence of trough remains like this, and as well as physical remains like this termite-eaten animal-footed leg. Wood doesn't survive well at Tombos, as well as pretty much throughout the rest of Sudan. And so we were very excited to find this actual remnant of a bed. Normally we're just tracing the remains that termites have left behind. Black Dot Pottery also appears, as you can see here as well, with this example from the same Ramesside tomb. The deceased sometimes shows indications of heavy binding and wrapping consistent with mummification. Traces of coffins also appear, but these elements are combined in various ways, including, but not exclusively, wrapping, coffin, and bed for the same individual. And then here you see the east-west orientation, which is consistent throughout the cemetery with only a couple of exceptions. One tomb where the individual is wrapped on a bed but not coffined had a rich group of jewelry, including a number of Egyptian amulets, but favoring particular deities like the dwarf god Bes and Patekos and the goddess Isis. And the larger amulets seem to come from a later burial, and the smaller ones from an earlier burial. An unusually large scarab with a unique design appears to be an innovation on Egyptian motifs. The large size of the scarab and the motif of offering bearers is, as far as I know, otherwise unattested. If anyone has seen this before, let me know. The Egyptian inspiration is clear, but the form is novel. Egyptian-style jewelry appeared in the same tomb, Nubian-style jewelry appeared in the same tomb and sometimes dominates burial assemblages in this area, including ivory bracelets, penannular earrings, which ultimately originate in Nubia, red seashell beads, and a remarkably glazed quartz crystal reminiscent of pendants found at Kerma. Taken together, this pattern, which is also reflected at other sites, contradicts the notion of the inherent appeal of Egyptian practices and material culture. Instead, these tombs show that far from abandoning Nubian culture or passively adopting Egyptian forms, individuals at Tombos and other sites were selectively adapting elements from Egypt and interweaving them with local practices and material culture. Even more, they were creating innovative new forms based on Egyptian designs like our scarab. Burials continued in the older part of the cemetery, including both the construction of new tombs and the reuse of older ones. A new pyramid tomb was constructed based on radiocarbon dates, either in the late Ramesside period or the early Napatan period, built over the remains of 18th dynasty tombs, including pottery, the collapse probably of Siamun's earlier tomb, as well as you can see an early radiocarbon date from before the tomb was built, and another one from roughly around the time the tomb was built. It has a unique shaft lined in stone without parallel in Egypt or Nubia, and again, let me know if anyone has seen anything like this. Again, reflecting local innovations and perhaps the continuing construction of private pyramid tombs into the Third Intermediate period or early Napatan period, which also appear in the 25th dynasty at Tombos and at other sites like Sedinga. One reused tomb contained the extraordinary burial of a horse in beautiful condition, including preserved fur, indicating that she was chestnut colored with white socks, not unlike my own horse. So I was really very excited when we found this horse. The horse was carefully laid out and covered in a linen shroud, which provided the early Napatan Third Intermediate period radiocarbon date. Horse burials provide another feature that represents a particularly complex long-term entanglement. And we were very lucky to find an example at Tombos. Animal burials were seen as a return to barbarism by earlier scholars, and to some extent still today, but represent practices with a long history in the region. Horse and other equid burials appear first in the Nile Delta and Asiatic contexts. The practice and horses themselves were introduced into Egypt via Western Asia, but the practice of burial was not widely adopted in Egypt. They do appear in a somewhat larger number of colonial era and Napatan period contexts in Nubia. With the first Kushite royal burials of the 25th dynasty, they reached their most elaborate form, with whole chariot teams buried in intricate trappings, as you can see here. Our horse, Amir, had a scarab and a bead that were probably attached to her tack, as well as this iron cheekpiece, which is a very early date for iron, but the date of iron production at Merowe is gradually being pushed earlier and earlier. Horses and chariotry were prestigious, valuable, and a show of military power, reflecting Kush's well-equipped army as opposed to Breasted's notion of an ineffective military. Wear on the bones at her withers suggests that our horse was indeed part of a chariot team, but the burial is much earlier than the royal tombs, dating the time when Nubian horses and trainers were famed in Western Asia and were specifically in demand in Assyria. I'm cheating a little bit here. This is a later relief, but it shows the importance of horses in the Assyrian military. So far from being an isolated backwater during this period, Kush was heavily engaged in the wider world, even at a time of the Nubian quote-unquote dark age. And indeed, the continuity and entanglements and innovations in Nubia contradict the common notion of a dark age that only ended with the rise of the Kushite dynasty, consistent with Breasted and other early archaeologists' assumptions of the rise and fall with Egyptian influence, a perspective that is diminishing but still influences the study of Nubia. Ceramics and a long series of radiocarbon dates demonstrate continuity at Tombos, with burials continuing both among the tumuli as well as in the older part of the cemetery, and the dates with an asterisk next to them are from the older part of the cemetery, the rest are from the tumuli. Transport vessels and Egyptian maraclays belie the notion of Nubian isolation during this period, demonstrating a constant flow of goods between Upper Egypt and Upper Nubia, as do the presence of amulets and other objects either made in Egypt or made locally, but tracking with current Egyptian designs. At the same time, Nubian-style pottery continues to make up a portion of the assemblage, as you can see with this blacktop vessel from the 25th dynasty context. As the late Laszlo Torik pointed out, Nubia was left with a considerable colonial infrastructure, including a sacred landscape, which reflects another important religious entanglement. As Luke Gabold has discussed recently, the Kushite Ran culture attested at Kerma profoundly influenced the theology and iconography of Amun-Re, one of Egypt's most important deities. Temples constructed in Nubia during the New Kingdom Empire and later emphasized Amun's ram form. The sacred mountain of Jebel Barkal became a major center for the worship of the god, explicitly referred to in Egyptian theology as his birthplace in the southern Karnak, mirroring Amun's chief temple complex in Egypt. As depicted here in Taharqa's Mut temple on the left, a new theology of the god placed its origin at Barkal within the mountain. The sacred complex became a focus for both Egyptian and later Kushite kingship ceremonies. Torik observes that Amun's ram resonated with that of another ram deity, Khnum, the patron god of Aswan, who himself was arguably Nubian, and was also popular in other contexts in Nubia. Intriguingly, Torok also notes that the Kerman Ram iconography may already have been influenced by Egyptian art, as you can see in the upper right-hand side, pointing to a very long history of mutual influence and interaction. The integration of Egyptian and Kushite cults, perhaps as part of an Egyptian colonial policy, as Gabold has suggested, would have strengthened ties between Kush and Thebes and helped to legitimate the authority of Kushite kings like Kashta and Pianki as rulers of both Egypt and Nubia. And there's no reason to think that the Nubian ascendancy at Thebes was a result of a military conquest. It could just as easily be the result of diplomatic and cultural ties. In the end, Pianki's journey in his triumphal stela is as much about piety as it is about the suppression of a revolt and domination of the petty Delta dynasts. He even offered mercy to those who surrendered, taking them to task for mistreating his horses, something I can sympathize with, and criticizing Libyan fish eaters as unclean, schooling them on how to approach a pharaoh, and perhaps engaging in an ethnic slur at the same time. It is a document that lays out a particularly Kushite vision of Egyptian kingship, but in a masterful way. The adaptation and enhancement of the office of the god's wife of Amun also reflects Kushite sensibilities by transforming an important local office along the lines of notions of Kushite female power, resulting in the office holders wielding considerable authority in Thebes. Similarly, the tombs of kings and queens in the royal cemetery, like Tunutamani and his mother Kalhata, place them on an equal footing in scale, decoration, and the choice of texts and vignettes, which, as Susan Dahl has pointed out, were to an extent adaptations and even new creations inspired by contemporary Egyptian practice. The Kushite officials who came to Thebes also had a profound impact locally. Elena Pishakova has traced the revival of monumental private tombs and the development of a distinctive Kushite archaizing style in her excavations of Kushite tombs in South Asasif. For example, she notes similarities between the representation of Karakamun, as you see here, in his tomb, one of the earliest of the new monumental tombs, and Shabako and especially Shabitko on Theban monuments. The pose, proportions, and exaggerated musculature all resonate with the royal Kushite style and harken back to the Old Kingdom. The later tomb of Montuamhe was itself influenced by these new Kushite forms that drew upon earlier Egyptian iconography, as well as statuary and representations of him. Part of Tombos's prosperity during the 20th dynasty may have been as a source of monumental royal statuary in this new archaizing style, like this example that was abandoned in the adjacent quarries. Egyptologists have been reluctant to give credit to Kushite artists. Indeed, Egyptologists running a workshop at the last Nubian conference in Paris argued that Kushites could not have created a new style in only around 100 years or less, a proposition that archaeologists in the session pushed back on. I mean, seriation wouldn't work if stylistic change was slow, inevitably, and also seemed a bit tone deaf, to be quite frank, at a conference devoted to Nubia. Style can change rapidly or slowly, so there's no a priori reason why a Kushite style could not emerge quickly or be later taken up in turn and adapted by the Sayites. In any case, the Kushite archaizing style continued through the Meroitic period, hundreds of years after. And here you see an example from Musarawat at Sufra with the lion god in the adaptation itself, Apetamak and Amun. You can see the musculature and so on, and the faces of the Nubian figures with more elaborate and evolved garments in this particular case. Meanwhile, back in Nubia, Kushite society was sophisticated and cosmopolitan, benefiting from interactions that stretched through Africa and into the Mediterranean world. This new set of entanglements is reflected dramatically in the burial of a soldier at Tombos, who you see here. On the one hand, he was buried in the Egyptian tradition, extended with head to the west to take advantage of the rejuvenating power of the rising sun. Although organic preservation was poor, enough evidence remained to clearly indicate that he was mummified and placed in an anthropoid coffin, which was then placed upon a bed in Nubian tradition, a practice that continues to this day. They don't bury the beds anymore, but I've seen it several times now. They take the deceased out to the cemetery lying upon a bed. He had traditional blacktop style pottery, as you can see here, and a compound bow with microlith tipped arrows, but also iron weaponry reflecting the latest technology. As with the tumuli earlier, he had amulets reflecting on a narrow selection of Egyptian deities, including Patekos as before, but adding Amun-Re, who had become the preeminent Kushite state deity. There's also a cat and a little frog tucked in there, and I'll be talking about frogs in just a minute. Quartz and hematite beads show a Nubian color sensibility resonating with the older practice of decorating tombs with black and white stones. And the biconical shape mimics Nubian ivory bead types. Like the earlier faience scarab from the tumuli, a remarkable copper alloy scarab has a unique variant on a widespread cryptographic inscription, expanding and adapting it to specifically reference Amun instead of a generic god. The only parallel for a copper scarab like this is one that comes from the cemetery at Sanam across the river from the Kushite capital at Napata. This object represents a sophisticated bit of theology, proceeding from an Egyptian form but innovative. Given the lack of parallels to the north, it was very likely made in Nubia, although I haven't had a chance to try and test the metal. Two copper alloy metal bowls were chased with groups of bulls, a third with cows. And here I'm helping you out a little bit. These things are very hard to photograph. Identical imagery of bulls charging ahead with horns down appears on what must be a locally produced faience bowl from a queen's tomb in the Royal Cemetery of El Kuru. This motif is common in the international style, appearing in multiple media, particularly on ivory and metal vessels, and you see some examples from Nimrud in Assyria here. Another bowl has images of a cow wearing a lotus blossom, and note the rosette medallion that again resonates with the international style, as well as the circular friezes of animals. The cow theme continued in a unique and elaborately decorated wooden cosmetic box. A cow suckling a calf, and I'll help you out here a little bit, appears in an open-work papyrus swamp background with a frieze of lotuses along the solid base. So you could have seen inside this vessel. It really is a remarkable piece of work. This motif matches one that plays a prominent role in ivory decoration in the international style, like this very similar motif on a furniture element from Nimrud. It also appears on Phoenician metal bowls. However, our box has the addition of a stork, doubtless a reference to the Ben-Ben bird of the creation myth, another innovation playing on Egyptian solar theology and the idea of a swampy primordial environment at the time of creation. Another side continues the papyrus swamp theme, but with the image of the infant Horus emerging from a lotus, flanked by a cow and a calf. This visible-induced luminescence photograph brings out some of the detail and also indicates the presence of the valuable pigment Egyptian blue, which fluoresces white here, and reflects the high quality of the piece. This motif also is common in the international style, in particular ivory plaques like these from Arslan Tash and Nimrud. The Nubian artist has again innovated, substituting the cow and the calf for the deities, creating an otherwise unattested motif. And again, if anyone has seen anything like this, please let me know. The other two sides also had cattle-related marshy motifs. One side was very badly damaged by one of the metal bowls, but two cattle with a similar black and white pattern that you can see here on this view from the inside can be reconstructed. One appears to have the figure of a person milking underneath. You can see here a motif that's attested in the Tel Basta treasure. We're still trying to work this out, but it looks pretty convincing. Another fragile but better preserved side of the box shows a woman walking through a swamp carrying a yoke with two pots and accompanied by a calf. And the top part is the inside of the box, where the colors were a bit better preserved. The bottom part is the outside of the box, and this gives you a sense of just how vivid this box would have been. And again, you could have seen in through the open work into the contents, but also the painted insides of the box as well. Really a unique and remarkable item. Here you can see a little bit more of the detail of the woman. The pose is a little unique, and the presence of the calf is also interesting. See some birds as well, filling out the swampy motif. And here's a false color de-stretch image that gives you a little more detail of the woman. This is also found as a motif on the Tel Basta treasure, and you can see some of the contents already visible as our conservator, Elizabeth Grolet, has done a brilliant job with this. Was gradually dismantling the box to get at the contents inside. And those contents were extraordinary, gradually revealed as Elizabeth carefully excavated the interior in our lab. It was like opening a present every time we came back from the field. Very cool. These included a variety of cosmetic equipment, including a set of iron tweezers, you can see here, and applicators. Again, the latest technology, copper alloy razors and a copper needle, you can also see here. But along with these were two ceramic and three extraordinary faience vessels that you can see gradually emerging here. And here are the copper tweezers and the first cosmetic vessel, a small blue faience bottle in the form of an alabastron, perhaps an adaptation of a stone vessel type in a new material. There are faience alabastra attested, particularly in the Aegean, but none that look quite like this one. Another lentoid shaped vessel is unique, a bit like a New Year's flask, but very differently decorated, as well as the shape, with the imitation of a bead net and rope system as if rigged for suspension, a traditionally Nubian practice. The craftsmanship of this piece is astonishing, and the design is completely unique. I mean, the faience artisans' art just doesn't get any better than this. The final vessel is also masterful in its rendering of attached Beth figures of a quality that compares to the finest examples from the Royal Cemetery at El Kuru. The control over different colors is really remarkable. The lid represents a frog on a lily flower, not a pad, and is amazingly detailed. It's only about 1 centimeter long. It's really incredible. Frogs also play a special role in Kushite theology, so its combination with Beths reflects the selectedness of Nubian adaptations of Egyptian motifs and deities, or if this wasn't made in Nubia, then the acquisition of these things, the appeal of them by our soldier or officer. Bess and the dwarf god Patekos played a particularly prominent role in amulets at the Royal Cemetery at Kuru and contemporary Merowe. And Bess in particular was incorporated into temples like this rock-cut temple dedicated to Mut, Amun's consort. Double-sided amulets like this one from Tombos that you saw the front side of earlier were also very popular in Nubia, apparently more so than in Egypt, where they do also appear, but there are really a lot of these things. And this one is a bit unique with the magical glyphs on the back and the particular configuration of the goddess and the god Patekos. The archaeological record at Tombos reflects a sophisticated cosmopolitan society with wide-ranging contexts, embedded in Africa, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean world. The closest parallel for our frog lids comes all the way across the Mediterranean from Sardinia. A similar lily lid from Sanam suggests that it may have been a local product, not an import. Other motifs similar to those appearing in our Kushite soldier tomb and elsewhere in Nubia appear across the Mediterranean, including cattle imagery from as far away as Italy, and this wonderful bowl in the Metropolitan Museum from Cyprus, and examples of scarabs with similar cryptographic inscriptions, the simpler version, from as far away as Sicily and Carthage. An imported shell from the tombs also demonstrates Kushite ties to the Red Sea. In conclusion, it can be difficult to trace Nubian influence in Egypt compared to Western Asia. In part, this is of course due to a more robust written record, for example, one that eases the identification of deities and theology and the flow of trade and other goods, styles, and practices like the Bronze and Iron Age International style, which themselves drew heavily on Egyptian iconography. In part, it is due to Egyptological bias, interpreting variances from Egyptian practices as mistakes rather than choices, and dismissing the possibility that Kushites might have innovated in, for example, a new art style. But I would argue that Nubian influence on Egypt and even Egyptian influence in Nubia is often more subtle because of their long-standing and close entanglements, like we see at Jebel Barkal here, starting with common origins in the Northeast African pastoral complex during the Green Sahara. Although their cultures diverged, different cultural elements would still resonate. For example, symbolism around cattle, including women's involvement in the cult of Hawthorne and our soldiers' decision to invest in his elaborate box and copper alloy bowls. In their long history of intercultural interactions, Nubian were influenced by, but also deeply influenced Egyptian cultural practices in specific social contexts. These entanglements produced diverse outcomes, varying by region, site, and even between individuals at different sites, reflecting an array of outcomes influenced by accumulations of individual choices about adoption, adaptation, indifference, and rejection of foreign features, as well as innovations flowing from these entanglements. Throughout Egypt and Nubia's long relationship, cultural influence was mutual and often subtle instead of unidirectional and monolithic. And thank you very much for your attention, and here are some acknowledgements. I also want to acknowledge my third co-director at Tombos, Dr. Mohammed Farouk Ali, who just taken up a position in Khartoum at Africa International University and received his PhD under me at UCSB, as well as Sarah Schrader, who's the co-director at Abu Fatima and has a position now at Leiden University. Okay, well, thank you very much. Okay, let's see here. There we go.
So thank you, Professor Smith, for such a rich presentation and for showing us such rich material. Are there any questions in the room or on Zoom or on YouTube? Maybe we can see. Can you raise your hand, please, if you are on Zoom and if you have any question? Or yes, can you show us the chat? Okay. And on YouTube, how can we see if there are? Okay. Okay. Okay, so I have one question because maybe I missed it, and about the objects that you showed that show some similar motifs with Nimrud and other seeds. What is the context actually when the context of their discovery in Tombos?
Yeah, so all of the objects that I showed in that last section were from this one particular tomb. And it's from the tomb of what appears to have been a soldier, given the amount of weaponry that was buried with him. Also, our Michel Bouzon, our bioarchaeologist and co-director, looked at the skeleton and determined that the guy was very muscular, so he would have made a very effective soldier. And this was found next to a Kushite period pyramid, so in the 25th dynasty. And there was a scarab of Shabaka, and the radiocarbon date, it's a bad time for radiocarbon dates because the calibration curve flattens out, but it's consistent with a 25th dynasty date, as with the pottery and other objects. But it really is a remarkable tomb. Tomb robbers had broken into it in antiquity and removed the torso of the individual, presumably going after some valuable gold jewelry around his neck. I like to think he had one of those wonderful ram amulets of Amun, but that's just fantasy on my part. But fortunately, the tomb itself then collapsed, probably from their poking a hole in through the vaulting that covered the chamber. And the tomb robbers just went, meh, we got everything we needed, so we'll just not bother to dig it out, thankfully, because everything else was preserved in situ. So it's a remarkably rich assemblage where we can really trace all of these different relationships. And really a remarkable group of objects. This guy was both well-connected, but also clearly had a very cosmopolitan attitude towards acquiring all of these objects, some of which were probably made elsewhere, like the copper alloy bowls may very well have been made in Phoenicia. I think the box must have been made locally, and some of the other objects like the faience vessels, they're just so unique that it seems likely that they were also made locally. And of course, there's a long tradition of faience production in Nubia, stretching back to the earlier Kushite Kerma period.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions? Yes, Professor Hawthorne.
Thank you so much. I am so interested about the vessels and its lid, a frog. In Egyptian Museum, in the collection of Ea and Toya, there are 4 limestone vessels. Actually, we have one of them, also the lid of this vessel, lotus and frog over it. Yeah, so do you think, I think the vessels are not Egyptian. So do you think this is from the Nubia or not? Do you know actually the vessels which I spoke about it or not? This is 4 limestone vessels from the collection of Ea and Toya, 18th dynasty, the mothers and the fathers, the parents of Tea.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, there are 4 limestone vessels. One of them, it's lid, the same which you showed to us. The lid lotus, and over it a frog. We don't have examples like that among the Egyptian artifacts or vessels like that. So we said this is most probably are not Egyptian, and some of them they said probably they came from the Nubia.
Yeah, that's really, I was not aware of that. I'm very aware of Nubia and Tuya's tomb, obviously, but I'll definitely take a look at that. thanks very much for pointing it out. And I think it's absolutely plausible that this represents an entanglement with early entanglement with Nubia, obviously earlier than our faience limb. But as I mentioned, frogs gained a real prominence in, at least in later Kushite theology. So there's some wonderful stone frogs that are not today at the National Museum in Khartoum, for example. So it wouldn't surprise me if it does represent some kind of Nubian influence, given that this is at the height of the Egyptian Empire in Upper Nubia. So it's quite possible. I'd be very interested. I'll take a look at that and see.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? I think, okay. I think also at some moment you talked about intersectionality at some point. Maybe can you explain a little bit what do you understand by this concept?
Sure. I mean, it obviously is a modern concept, but I think we can apply it in antiquity as well. And that's the notion that identity is also a complex phenomenon generally. And obviously, for obvious reasons, we're kind of emphasizing ethnic identity here at this conference, looking at the interaction of different peoples from different places. However, identity is again, situational and socially contingent. It's mutable, and various axes of identity can be prominent in different social contexts. And they can also intersect. So in the context, for example, of our Nubian women who are buried in Nubian style at tombos with these kind of entangled practices, we can see this as an intersection between actually three different axes of identity: gender, power or wealth, as well as ethnicity. Because it's quite clear that these women, in the context of burial, were making a very clear statement about identity. And burial is an important place where identity is central. And here, being carried out on a bed to the cemetery versus in a coffin or mummified would have really sent a message about the place of these women in colonial society. But then there are also questions about their position in society. In this case, one of the women, her arm was displaced, probably to get valuable jewelry around her neck, the one with those wonderful little Bess amulets that were actually behind her neck, that had been broken away from the string of beads that was robbed. And this would indicate that she occupied a certain social position. So it's part of cultural negotiations within societies, jockeying for position. And we can see the women dancing for Hawthorne in a similar way. So clearly their affiliation as Nubians, and then the Nubian connection with Hawthorne and the myth of the sun's eye played a role in their significance in the rituals, but as well their ability to dance and their gender also played a key role. And so again, we see an intersection of these different axes of identity. So it's just important to remember that we can see overlapping, overlapping areas of identity that, and not just to focus on one, but to think about social status, where we can also see things playing out in different ways, as well as gender, as well as ethnicity, as well as religion, and so on. But especially intersectionality in the context of power, which is, of course, a key one, especially in colonial context in the Middle and New Kingdom.
Thank you very much. If there are any questions or comments. Okay, so thank you so much again, Professor Smith, for being with us on a Saturday morning.
Yes, yeah, morning for me, evening for you. So, but I appreciate the invitation and all your attention. Okay,
I think there is one question on Zoom, so maybe I can read it. No, I can. Okay. Oh, okay. So it was just a thank you. Okay, so thank you to all the people who followed us on Zoom and on YouTube for the very first lecture. There is one question. Okay, just one question.
Let's see.
If you can see it.
Yeah, so actually I see a couple of things. Ali Abdul Halim Ali mentioned that frogs symbolize fertility, and we see this commonly with Nilotic cultures, and that's very true. But again, it is something that also appears in Nubia. Of course, it does appear in Egypt as well. And then Susan Hollis asks about the context of Bess and Patekos in Nubia, and they do appear in personal relation of women in Israel. And that's, of course, Bess also does extend out into Israel with a remarkable, monumental Bess from the site of Sidon, which shows quite a lot of Egyptian influence in, I believe, the Persian period. But in Nubia, definitely Bess acquired a sort of special relationship. The connection with women is also clear in Egypt, as well as in our example from Tumbos in Nubia. And this highlights another interesting thing is women are often dismissed as sort of just following along with the male sort of activities of empire and conquest. But this also reflects that women may have played a key role that has been previously undervalued in the intercultural encounter, particularly in the context of colonization, by both insisting on the preservation of certain Nubian practices, but also adopting certain Egyptian ones like the god Bess. But Bess becomes especially prominent more generally in Nubia during this period, although it is interesting that those big monumental Bess column statues, like I showed from Jebel Barkal, Temple B300, a temple dedicated to the goddess Mut. So there may be a feminine connection there as well. So again, a bit of an intersection of different things. And of course, Bess is particularly popular in Egypt, presumably also in Nubia as a household deity, protecting children and women in domestic contexts.
Thank you. I think there is another question. Prepare? No. The other about the dog collar, I think there was a question from Ivo Nazic. If you can see them.
Yes, mention.
So I can read it. Another question. You mentioned boards on various occasions in the iconography naturally. Are salcons, I don't see. Are salcons featured? Are they found in ritual context, in offerings or burial?
Sorry, Salcon? What is?
Falcon, I'm sorry.
Oh, falcons.
I'm sorry, I misspelled it.
That's all right. I know I have big fingers and sometimes have problems with that too. Let me think. In terms of Tumbos, we don't see a big emphasis on falcons, although we do see some falcon imagery. But falcons actually don't seem to be much taken up, at least to my knowledge, in Nubian iconography. The main focus is on, as I said, Nubians, in terms of religious influence, were selective in their adoption of Egyptian deities, emphasizing gods like Khnum, and of course, ram-headed deity, the ram-headed manifestation of Amun, as well as sometimes appearing as human-headed, and the lion god, Epetimak, in the later Meroitic period, a local deity that was kind of elevated. So I don't know much. I don't know really much about falcons. Of course, with the A group, you have that kind of Horus falcon imagery, and of course, the king, the royal Kushite royal ideology does talk about Horus and so on, and Osiris and that configuration. But yeah, I don't know much in the way of falcon imagery.
Connected with Horus, that's true. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the little birds on the decorated box were something that popped up with conservation. So as we cleaned the box and then did these visible induced luminescence images, they popped out there as scuttling along, but they're part of that overall marshy kind of fertile, fecundity motifs connected with
ducks, geese,
creation and fertility and so forth.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I was interested also about the dog collars. Understand those, if I didn't miss it, they were actually found in a burial? The dog
Yeah,
collar?
so the dog collars were from the tomb of Maherpri. Not without the dogs.
Okay.
But the practice of actual physical dog burials is one that's common in Nubia. And at the cemetery at Abu Fatma, we found an example from a bit earlier, from around the beginning of the New Kingdom, first intermediate period. We also found an example from the Meroitic period as well. So the dog included in the tomb.
Could I contact you directly later on, just not to keep people here? I'd greatly appreciate a reference to that.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. One last question from Cynthia. Since the frog-leaded vessel has a parallel in Yuya and Tuya, as Dr. Hassan pointed out, is there any possibility that the faience piece is a heirloom from the 18th dynasty? And is the box connected to the distant goddess rituals?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I think the existence of a parallel on Sardinia suggests that maybe not from the 18th dynasty. It does seem to fit in the kind of Iron Age style. It also fits that best vessel really well. So I'm inclined to think probably not, that it would have been either a local piece or made in the international style. It's also in really, really good condition. As you saw, the colors are bright. I mean, it looks like it was made yesterday. So I don't think it had been saved and held for any considerable length of time. That scarab that we found on the horse, the back of it was heavily worn. So that's one of the reasons why I think perhaps it was used intact, but it also is a bit older. So we have several examples of scarabs at Tombos that were clearly heirlooms from earlier periods, including some from the Middle Kingdom found in New Kingdom context. So it's not an impossibility. But that whole assemblage looks like it's kind of new, fancy, kind of shiny stuff that our soldier was accumulating. Although I don't know if it might be connected with the distance goddess rituals directly, but I think there is definitely kind of Hathoric imagery showing up on there, as well as maybe with the cow and calf, something, and that image of the Horus emerging from the lotus, and maybe some connection with Isis as well. But certainly, there could be some connection with the distance goddess, which will be interesting to explore that possibility.
Okay, so thank you so much once again. Thank you all for following us. And thank you, Professor Smith, for this very rich presentation and also for this very rich discussion. And looking forward to meeting you all tomorrow morning.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.
Have a nice day.
Yeah.